Dragged by her hair through the saloon street, a cowboy lifted her up and gave her a crown. The rope was still looped over the saddle horn when I rode in. That's the thing I remember first, not the noise, not the crowd, not even her. The rope. Somebody had used it for something ugly, and whoever it was hadn't bothered to coil it clean after. Just left it hanging there in a slack loop, the way you leave something you're not ashamed of. I'd been on the trail since before light. My horse, a blue roan I called Cutter on account of the way he moved through a herd, was dusty to the belly, and I wasn't much better. I had a letter in my vest pocket from my employer, a rancher named Aldous Prine who ran the biggest spread in the Bitterroot Valley, and the letter said to meet him in Garnet Fork by noon on the 14th. I didn't know what day it was exactly. I'd lost track somewhere along the second river crossing. But I figured I was close enough to noon on close enough to the 14th that a man of Prine's impatience would still be waiting. I wasn't thinking about trouble. I was thinking about a hot meal and whether the livery in Garnet Fork would have decent feed for Cutter, and whether Prine's business would keep me 2 days or 3. That was the whole of my mind coming down that main street. Practical things, small things, the arithmetic of the road. Then I saw her. She was on her knees in the dirt in the middle of the road, about 40 yards ahead of me. A crowd of maybe 30 people stood back from her in a loose half-circle the way crowds do, far enough to say they didn't cause it, close enough to watch. There were 2 men standing over her. One of them had hold of what was left of her hair. The other was talking, loud enough that I could pick up words even over the sound of Cutter's hooves and my own blood going up in my ears. He was saying she was a thief. He was saying she'd worked in his establishment under false pretenses, which I understood to mean she'd refused to do what he'd hired her for. He was saying other things I won't put a name to. The man with her hair had dragged her, I found out later, the full length of the saloon porch and down the steps and 12 feet into the road. The dust was caked in the side of her face. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. She wasn't crying. That's the other thing I noticed. She was on her knees in the dirt with half the town watching, and she was not crying. Her jaw was set hard, and her eyes were fixed on a point above their heads, the way a person fixes their eyes when they've decided that wherever they're looking right now is the only place they're going to look, and nothing in the world is going to move them from it. I pulled Cutter up. He stopped and blew once through his nose and stood. I sat there on him and looked at what I was looking at for a few seconds. Not because I needed time to decide. I already knew what I was going to do. I suppose I was just giving myself a moment to make sure I was seeing it right. I stepped down off Cutter. I'm not a man who was born to be a hero. I want to say that plainly because it matters. I was 44 years old. I had been a cowhand, a drover, a fence rider, a horsebreaker, and for the last 6 years the top hand on Prine's operation, which was a different kind of work. You run cattle and you run men, and you are responsible for what happens to both. I had been married once, and my wife had died of fever when we were young, and I had not married again or even tried because I was a particular kind of lonesome that felt like it had become permanent. The way a fence post that's been in the ground long enough stops being something you put there and starts being something that was always there. I did my work. I was good at it. I didn't go looking for things that weren't my business. But there are things that are every man's business. I looped Cutter's reins over the nearest post, and I walked across that street. The crowd parted for me not because of anything dramatic I did, but because people who are watching something shameful will move out of the way when someone walks toward it like he intends to do something about it. They don't want to be between the doer and the doing. I've seen that a number of times in my life. A crowd that was perfectly willing to stand and watch will find a way to be elsewhere when a man with some intention in his walk comes through. I came up and I stood next to the man who was holding her hair, and I said, "Let go of her." He was a big man, bigger than me across the shoulders, with a red face and a gambler's coat that had seen better days. He let go of her. Not because he was afraid of me, I don't think, but because I had come up so close and so quiet that it broke something in the moment. The way a cold draft coming under a door will make a candle go sidewise even if the room is still otherwise. He hadn't expected someone to walk through the audience. He said, "Who the hell are you?" I said my name. I said I was Aldous Prine's top hand and that I was here on Prine's business and that I was in the habit of finishing what I came to do, which meant I'd be in Garnet Fork for a few days at least. I didn't say it as a threat. I said it as a fact, which is worse because a threat a man can argue with, but a fact just sits there. There was a particular silence that followed that. It's hard to describe if you haven't been in it. Prine's name carried in the Bitterroot. It carried the way the name of a large, cold river carries, not loudly, but with a weight behind it that people understood without having to think about it. His range ran to the north and east of town, and 3 of the men in that crowd were likely in debt to him one way or another, and the town itself had been surveyed on land he donated, and the bank had his name on a bronze plate by the door. The man with the gambler's coat said nothing for a moment. His face went through a few things. Then he said she still owed him for the room and the board she'd taken from his establishment. I said, "How much?" He said a number. I didn't argue with it. I didn't think it was right. I thought it was probably inflated by about half, but I reached into my vest and counted it out and held it to him. Sometimes the fastest way through is to close the door on a man's argument before he can get comfortable in it. He looked at the money, he looked at me. He took it. Then I turned away from him, which is its own kind of statement, and I went down to one knee in the dirt next to her. Up close she was younger than I'd thought from horseback. Maybe 26, 27. Dark hair, dark eyes, a thin scar above one brow that was old and healed. She had the kind of face that would have been called handsome in the places I'd lived rather than beautiful, meaning it was a face with something in it, something that looked like it had been somewhere and paid attention. Her hands were in her lap and her knuckles were scraped. I said, "Can you stand?" She looked at me for a long moment. She was deciding something. I could feel it, that particular kind of looking where a person is not so much seeing your face as measuring your intentions. And I understood that. A woman who'd just been dragged through the street by her hair by 2 men had reason to be measuring the intentions of the next one. She said, "Yes." I put out my hand and she took it and stood. When she got upright, she let go of my hand immediately, not rudely but firmly, like a person who is willing to accept a hand up but not a hand that lingers. I respected that. I released it clean. I said my name again, full. I said, "Where were you headed?" She said she had a brother in a town called Whiteston, which was a mining settlement about 30 miles north. She'd come west on the stage, she said, and run out of money for the rest of the fare, and she'd taken work at the saloon thinking it was for kitchen work, which was what she'd been told. And when she found out it wasn't kitchen work, she'd refused, and the matter had gone the way it went. 30 miles north, I said, "I'll take you." She looked at me again. Same measuring look, longer this time. I didn't try to fill the silence with words because I've found that when a person is trying to decide whether to trust you, more words are often the wrong thing. You either are what you look like or you're not, and talking a lot is how people who aren't what they look like try to seem like they are. I stood and waited. She said, "My bag is still inside." I went in and got her bag. The barkeep didn't say anything to me. Neither did the 2 men who were now at the bar with the money I'd paid them, already turning the moment into something else inside their own heads. I'd seen that before. What they'd done was becoming in their minds a thing that had just sort of happened, a thing without a clear cause, a business transaction that happened to have gotten loud. The absence of consequence makes men rewrite the story fast. Her bag was behind the bar, small, canvas with a brass buckle that had been repaired with wire. I picked it up and went outside. She was waiting on the boardwalk. She'd done something with her hair, pinned it back, pulled it together somehow, used 2 pins she'd had in her pocket. She'd straightened her dress and shaken the worst of the dust from her skirt. She looked like someone who had decided to leave that street behind her, and had already mostly done it inside her own head before she'd even left the street. I found out later that was how she was about most things. She did the hard work in her head first, then her hands just finished the job. We rode out of Garnet Fork about a half hour after I'd ridden in. Her name was Nora Callum. Her brother's name was Declan, and he had been working the silver mines outside Whiteston for 2 years, and had written her a letter in March saying he was sending for her to come keep house for him because he'd been sick and had no one. She'd come from Illinois, from a town outside Springfield that had grown up around a mill, and then the mill had closed, and the town had slowly stopped being a going thing. It had taken her 11 days by train and stage. She rode behind me on Cutter because it was the only horse I had, and she rode the way people who have spent time on horseback ride, back straight, hands light on my sides, not clutching, not falling back, moving with the horse's motion without fighting it. At some point during that first hour, probably without knowing she did it, she relaxed her shoulders, and I felt the change in the weight behind me when a person stops bracing. For the first few miles, she said nothing and I said nothing. The trail north ran along a creek lined with cottonwoods, and the afternoon light was coming in low and flat, the kind of light that turns dust gold and makes even a plain country look like it has something behind it. Cutter moved easy. He was a horse who didn't mind carrying two. She said, "You didn't know me." I said that was true. Didn't have any reason to do that. I said I did it because it needed doing. She thought about that, a beat, 2 beats. Then she said, "That's either a very simple thing to say or a very complicated one." I said, "It's simple." She was quiet another mile. The creek wound left, and we followed it, and there were red-winged blackbirds in the cattails making their noise. Then, "How well does that name carry in these parts?" "The one you used." I said the name I used wasn't mine, strictly. That I'd said my employer's name because it was the name that would do the job. My name was Harlan Cross, and it didn't carry anywhere in particular, and that was fine by me. A man's reputation should be local anyway. It should be built in the places where people can see the work. She said Harlan Cross, like she was testing the sound of it, letting it sit in the air to see what shape it had. Then, "I'll remember that one." We made camp that first night on the east bank of a small river that didn't have a name on any map I knew. I made a fire in a ring of stones left by whoever had camped there last, which was maybe a week ago by the look of the ash. I had enough in my saddle kit for coffee and dried meat and hardtack, which was not much but was something. She ate without complaint and drank her coffee straight and didn't remark on the hardtack, which was stale enough to deserve remarking on. After a while she asked me what I did for Prine. I told her. She asked what it meant to be a top hand. I explained it, that you were the man between the owner and the crew, that you made the decisions that kept the whole thing from flying apart on a daily basis, that when something went wrong at 3 in the morning, you were the one who got up and dealt with it, that you learned to see problems before they became problems, and the best days were the days when nothing notable happened, because everything had been managed early, that it was a position that carried responsibility without much acknowledgement, which was fine, because acknowledgement was not what I'd ever been in the habit of expecting from the work. She listened carefully. When I finished, she said, "It sounds like the kind of work that builds a man nobody sees." I sat with that for a while. The fire popped once and settled. There was something so exact about what she'd said that I didn't know what to say back. She'd named a thing I'd never quite found the language for, something I'd known was true about my life for years but had never made into words. Because that was what 20 years of honest work had done. It had built me into something solid and capable and completely invisible, and I'd made a kind of peace with that mostly, except on certain nights when the peace didn't quite hold. I said, "I suppose that's right." She said, "It shouldn't be." I looked at her across the fire. She wasn't looking at me with sympathy. She was looking at me the way she'd looked at me in the street, straight on, measuring but with something else now, something that was either an early form of respect or something more, and I was not experienced enough at reading women at this point in my life to know which. I turned back to the fire. The next morning we rode again. The country opened up after the creek, rolling grassland with the mountains to the west, showing their snow above the timberline, clouds building over the peaks the way they do in the afternoon, even in good weather. Cutter was rested and moved well, and Nora had braided her hair in the morning with a piece of cord she'd had in her bag, and she looked like she'd been riding for years rather than spending a night in her second camp on the ground. We talked more that day. She told me about Illinois and the mill town and what it had been like watching a place go slow and quiet when the work left it. About her mother and how she'd cared for her in the last years. About Declan, who had always been the kind of man who reached for the far thing, which she said without judgment. It was just his nature, always had been. She'd watched him go to the mines with a kind of steady acceptance, not warm, not cold. Just knowing he was going to go and letting him. I told her about the range. About the years before Prine, when I'd been drifting from outfit to outfit, good work here, bad outfit there, the whole catalog of cowhand, jobs that a man collects when he's young enough to keep moving. About finding Prine's operation and recognizing it as a place worth staying, and becoming over years the man who knew every foot of it. She said at some point, without looking up from the trail, "Were you ever sorry you didn't leave? Find your own place?" I said I'd thought about it, that there'd been a time, maybe 8 or 9 years back, when I'd had enough put by that I could have started something small. I'd looked at a few parcels of land, but the timing had been wrong, or I'd told myself it was, and then the moment had passed and I was back inside Prine's operation, and that was that. She said, "Why was the timing wrong?" I thought about it honestly. Then I said, "I didn't have anyone to do it for. It's easier to take a risk when there's someone else in the calculation." She nodded but said nothing. We rode on. After a mile she said, "That's honest." I said I tried to be. We made the second camp at the edge of a pine grove, where a spring came out of the rock and made a small pool before going underground again. Better than the night before real water, the horses able to drink without packing them to the creek, and a wind break from the trees. She slept on one side of the fire and I slept on the other, and in the morning there was frost on the ground and she was up before me, which I found later was always the case. We came into Whiteston late in the second day. The mining camp was bigger than I'd expected, 2 main streets of raw lumber buildings, a stamp mill audible from a quarter-mile out, mule teams going up and down from the mine heads on the hillside above town. The streets were deep with mud from the recent rain, and it smelled like mud and blasting powder and the particular sweetness of wood smoke mixed with pine, and the faint sulfur from the smelter running on the edge of camp. Nora knew her brother's address because she'd written it in a small notebook she kept in her bag. We found the cabin in the upper part of town, on the 2nd street from the hill, a 2-room place with a crooked porch and a woodpile that needed splitting badly. The door was open, a sound of movement from inside. Declan Callum was 31 and looked older. He'd been sick, she'd said, and the sickness showed. He was thin in the way that hard work and poor food make a man thin, the kind of thin where the bones are close to the surface and you can see a man's jaw muscles working even when he's at rest. There was a yellow tinge to his eyes that I noticed and didn't comment on. But he was upright and walking, and when he saw his sister in the doorway, he made a sound I've never quite been able to describe. Not a shout or a word, just something that came out of him from somewhere below language. They held on to each other for a while. I stood back and held Cutter's bridle and looked at the woodpile and thought about the yellow in his eyes and thought about what that usually meant. After a while, Nora came back outside and looked at me, and I think she knew from my face that I'd noticed. She said, "He'll be all right. He just needs someone to look after him." I said I thought she was probably right. She said, "Will you stay tonight? It's a long trail back." I said I had Prine waiting. She said, "He's waited 2 days. One more won't ruin him." That was true. I stayed. Declan Callum was a good man going through a hard patch, which is what most men are at one time or another. At supper, Nora had found enough in the cabin's provisions to make something real, a hash with salt pork and dried potato and a little onion that she coaxed out of the back of the cabinet, better than anything I'd eaten in 4 days. He told me about the mine and the work and the country and the particular kind of loneliness of a mining camp, which is different from the loneliness of the range. On the range, the loneliness is at least wide. In a mining camp, it's narrow and close and smells like other men, and you can go months without seeing something that isn't a wall of rock or the inside of a bunkhouse. He asked about me. I told him what I told most people, the broad strokes of the work, the years of it where I'd been. He listened the way a man listens when he's genuinely interested rather than waiting for his turn to talk. There's a difference, and you can feel it. He said, "Nora says you paid those men to let her go." I said I'd settled a debt. He looked at me a long time, something working in his face that he was keeping private. Then he said, "I'll pay you back." I said there was no need. He said there was. I could see it mattered to him, not the money itself, but the principle of it. A man who couldn't protect his own family needs to believe there is still a way to make the account whole, some way to remain a man in the transaction even when he was the one who'd been absent. I said, "When you're back on your feet, no hurry." He nodded. That was the end of it between us, and we both knew the money was not the point. After supper, while Declan was sleeping, he tired early, the way sick people do, his body using everything it had just to hold itself together. Nora and I sat on the crooked porch in the dark. She had a cup of the bad coffee from the cabin's small stove, and I had nothing, and we looked at the lights of the camp on the hillside above, the lanterns on the hoist cables going up and down in their slow, regular rhythm. She said, "What will you do when you're done working for Prine?" I said I hadn't thought about it much. "You should." I said I'd never been much for planning past the next season. That next season was about as far ahead as the work ever let me see clearly. "That's a lonely way to live," she said. Not a criticism. Just an observation, the way she said it, matter of fact, nothing accusatory in it, just a person naming a thing plainly. I said, yes, it is. We were quiet a while. The cable hoist went up and then down and then up again. Somewhere below us, a mule was complaining about something. She said, my brother is going to need care for a while, more than I knew. She said it looking at the hillside. I'll be here some time. I said Whiteston was a decent enough place if a person needed to be somewhere. She said, there's work in Garnet Fork, real work, the kind I know how to do. A pause. That's closer to where you are. I turned to look at her. She was still looking at the hillside. Her profile in the lamplight from the window was steady and quiet, the same way she'd been in the street, fixed on something, already decided about something. She was a woman who thought things through and then stated them without fanfare, which I found I liked considerably. I'd spent years around men who stated things they hadn't thought through, and that was a different experience entirely. She said, I'm not a woman who announces herself, Harlan, but I'm not a woman who lets things go unsaid either when they're worth saying. She turned and looked at me directly. You walked across that street when 30 people stood and watched, not for glory, not because you were looking for someone, just because it needed doing, and you've been decent every minute since. A pause. There aren't a lot of men like that. The lamp from inside threw a narrow line of yellow, light across the boards of the porch between us. I said, you don't know me very well. She said, I know you well enough. 2 days on one horse tells you most of what you need to know about a man. Something at the corner of her mouth, almost a smile. You didn't try to be more than you are. That's rarer than it ought to be. I said nothing for a while. The stamp mill on the hill had gone quiet for the night, and without it you could hear the creek somewhere below the camp, and the wind moving through the pines on the ridge. Then I said, I come through Garnet Fork every few weeks. She said, I know. I said, I'll look in on you and your brother. When he's stronger. She said, I'd like that. She stood then, and she put her hand against my jaw for a moment, not long, just long enough to be a thing that happened and not a thing imagined. And she looked at me with that clear, measured, decided look, and she said, Good night, Harlan Cross. Then she went inside. I sat on that crooked porch for another hour in the dark, listening to the cables hum on the hillside and the mules shift in the corral and the creek running below. And the whole of what had just occurred settled into me the way things settle when they're real, not fast, not with any noise, just a quiet taking of permanent shape. I rode back to Garnet Fork the next morning and found Prine in the hotel, which had the best dining room in town, eating a late breakfast. He looked up when I came in and said, You're 2 days late, Cross. I said, Yes, sir. There was a matter that needed tending to. Prine was 60 and had built his fortune by being smarter than most people and harder than the rest, and he had a way of looking at a man that made you feel he was reading something in the back of your skull. He looked at me that way for a moment. Then he said, Sit down. I'll order you something. He didn't ask about the matter. That was Prine. He'd built what he built partly by knowing when a man's reasons were his own. The business he had for me took 3 days. It was a boundary dispute with a neighboring rancher, a man named Ott Vellum who was running cattle onto the southeast corner of Prine's range and claiming the survey line was off. Vellum was not a bad man, but he was an optimistic one, and optimistic men and survey lines are a difficult combination. I rode the boundary with Vellum's foreman, a solid man named Briggs who I think knew perfectly well the line was right, but had been sent to make the argument as a professional duty. We found the survey stakes, and they were where the plat said they were, and I made a careful drawing of the line in relation to the creek and the 2 ridgelines and gave it to Prine, and that settled it. On the evening of the second day, walking back from the livery, I passed the front of the building that had been a surveyor's office and was now something else. There was a new sign in the window. It said, N. Callum, Laundry and Mending, inquire within. She'd been faster than I'd expected. I didn't go in that night. I finished my work for Prine and settled up with the hotel, and in the morning, before I rode north to the ranch, I tied Cutter in front of the laundry and went in. The inside was still being put together, a sorting table rough-built from 2 sawhorses and a board, 2 large kettles on a small iron stove that was not quite right for the job but would do, a line strung from wall to wall. It smelled like lye and something fainter underneath, a dried herb of some kind. She was tacking a board above the sorting table, and she had 3 nails in her teeth, and she looked back when I came in and took the nails out of her teeth and said, You're leaving. I said I was. She said, "Did the business go well?" I said it went as expected. She nodded. She looked at the board she'd been tacking. Then she looked back at me and said, "I'll be here when you come through." I said, "I know." She handed me the nails. "Hold these while I finish this." I held the nails. She finished tacking the board. Then she took the nails back, one at a time, from my open palm, and her fingers were dry and steady, and she didn't fumble any of them. She was already moving to the next thing before she'd finished with the last one. I said, "How's your brother?" She said, "Better. Slower than I'd like, but better. He's going to be fine." Said it with certainty, not the false certainty of hope, but the certainty of someone who has already decided to make it true and is simply informing you of the outcome. I stood there another moment. I am not a man who has ever been graceful about leaving somewhere he didn't want to leave. I have always just left because drawing it out is worse. So I put my hat back on my head and I said, "I'll see you in a few weeks, Miss Callum." She said, "Nora." I said, "Nora." She turned back to her work. In the weeks that followed, each time I came through Garnet Fork, I found the laundry doing better. Women talk. A woman who does good work with a hot iron and charges fair prices becomes known fast in a town, because the need is constant, and the quality is not always. By the third time I came through, there were 2 women working the kettles in back, and a chalk board on the wall with prices, and a ledger on the counter that she kept in a precise, neat hand. She and I settled into a rhythm over those months. When I came through, I'd stop, and she'd set down whatever she was doing and put water on for coffee, and we'd sit at the small table she'd put in the corner by the window, the one that was technically for customers to wait, but that we both understood was ours. We talked the way people who are paying attention to each other talk, asking real questions, listening to the real answers, not filling the silence with noise when it didn't need filling. I learned things about her gradually, the way you learn things about a place you're coming to know, not all at once, but in the small pieces that add up to a whole. She'd kept house for her mother for 3 years while her father was away and her brother was too young. This was in the years when she was 15, 16, 17. It had given her a kind of competence that had nothing to do with age. She moved through practical problems the way a river moves around rocks, not making drama of the obstacles, just finding the line that worked and taking it. She'd wanted to go to school. Had wanted it badly, she said once, looking at her coffee. There'd been a teacher in the town who'd told her she had a mind for it, that she should find a way to keep studying. But circumstances had gone the way they'd gone, and the teacher had moved on, and the school had closed along with everything else when the mill went quiet. She said it without self-pity, which made it land harder somehow than self-pity would have. I told her things too, things I hadn't told most people. About the years after my wife died, not the grief itself, which I couldn't have articulated well, but the practical consequence of it, which was a long stretch of just writing and working with no anchor, going from outfit to outfit partly because there was good work, and partly because staying anywhere felt like being asked to remember something I didn't have the resources yet to remember. About eventually landing at Prines, and finding in the work itself a kind of structure that held me together, while the rest of me figured itself out. She listened. She didn't soften it or round it off or say the kinds of things people say when they want to move past something uncomfortable. She just listened, and when I was finished, she'd nod or ask a question, and that would be that. There was a comfort in being listened to that I hadn't felt in a long time, maybe ever. Town itself noticed us, eventually. People noticed those things. There was some talk. I was gone most of the time, away on Prines Range, and she was a woman running her own business and looking after her brother on his monthly visits from Whiteston. And the 2 of us sitting in the corner of the laundry over coffee was a subject that a town with enough hours on its hands was going to have opinions about. She ignored the opinions with the same clean efficiency she'd used on the stagecoach woman in Anchor Creek. I ignored them because I had not spent my life earning other people's approval and wasn't going to start. Declan came down from Whiteston in June. His eyes had cleared. He'd put weight back on, and his color was good, and he shook my hand with a grip that had some substance to it again. He'd given up the mines, told me over supper that he'd gone as far underground as a man could go and come back out, and he didn't intend to go back. He'd been doing work at the livery in Whiteston, and had his eye on a small freighting operation that was being sold off by a man who decided to go back east. He asked me questions about it, how to evaluate the equipment, what to look for in the mule stock, how to think about the routes. I told him what I knew, It was useful to him. I could see that, and I found that it mattered to me that it was useful. It was 6 weeks, that second time, before I came through Garnet Fork again. There had been a hard stretch on the range, cattle through a fence in the southeast, a horse with a bad leg that I'd had to put down, 2 hands who quit the same week for reasons that were both legitimate and still frustrating, and a late storm that had come through with no warning and dropped snow in June on cattle that weren't prepared for it. The kind of sustained difficulty that makes a man feel like the whole world is a piece of machinery running specifically against him. By the time it was over, I'd fixed what could be fixed and replaced what could be replaced, and the cattle count was down 11 head, and I was tired in the deep way, not the kind that sleep fixes. I was tired of holding things together and having it not be enough. I was tired of the particular loneliness of leadership, which is that you can't let it show while you're in it because someone needs to be steady, and you are the someone. I rode into Garnet Fork on a Thursday and tied Cutter at the rail in front of the laundry and went in. She was at the sorting table with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hair up, writing in the ledger. She looked up when I came in and she saw my face, and she didn't remark on what was in it. She didn't say you look tired or you look rough or anything that would have required me to answer a question about how I felt. She just said, "Sit," and pointed at the chair. I sat. She brought me coffee and went back to her work, and for a while the only sound was the water working in the kettles and the scratch of her pen in the ledger and the street noise coming in from outside. She let me be quiet for a while, and that was exactly right. After a time she came and sat across from me and said, "Tell me." So I told her, the fence and the horse and the 2 hands and the storm and the 11 head. I told it plainly, without drama, probably in a way that made it sound smaller than it felt. She listened all the way through without interrupting, which was not what most people did. Most people, when you're telling them about difficulty, are already composing their response before you're done. She waited. When I was finished, she said, "That's a lot of holding together." I said, "That's the job." She said, "I know what the job is. I'm saying that's a lot of holding together, and you look like a man who has been doing it alone for a very long time." I said, "I have." She looked at me steadily for a moment. Then she said, "You don't have to." Simply said, not a declaration, not a proposal, not a promise with conditions attached. Just a statement offered plainly with the same directness she brought to everything, take it or leave it. No added decoration meant to make it easier. I said, "I am not an easy man to know. I'm not asking for easy. I am on the road more than I'm anywhere. I know that. Prine's operation is 40 miles north. When things go wrong, which they do regularly, I am not available for." I stopped because I didn't know how to finish without making assumptions about what she was saying. She finished it for me. "For the ordinary things," she said. "I know. I run a business alone because I prefer to know I can. I am not a woman who needs someone present to know they're there." She looked at her coffee. "But there's a difference between being alone because you have to be and choosing it." The afternoon light was lying flat across the sorting table and the chalk board with its prices, and the stack of folded shirts waiting for their owners. Outside, a wagon went by heavy laden, and the boards of the laundry floor vibrated faintly. I said, "I am going to be direct with you." She said, "Please." "I would like to come back here when I can, regular. I would like to know you better. I think—" I stopped. I started again. "I think you are the best woman I have ever had reason to sit across a table from, and I have not had much occasion to say that to anyone." She looked at me for a long moment. Something moved in her face, not surprise, because I didn't think I surprised her much, and not pleasure exactly, but a kind of quiet recognition. Like she was confirming something she'd already suspected, and was satisfied to find it was what she'd thought. She said, "That's a start." And then she smiled at me. It was the first real smile I'd seen from her, not the near smiles and corner-of-the-mouth things from before, but a real one, coming up from somewhere true in her, full and plain. Not a decorative thing, not performed. Just a real expression of a real feeling, and it hit me somewhere under my ribs with a force I hadn't anticipated. She put her hand on the table between us, palm up. I put mine in it. She closed her fingers and she held on, and she looked at me with that clear, certain, already decided look. And I felt something in me that had been shut and locked for a very long time go quietly slack, like a door someone finally remembered the key to. That was the spring. By summer, I was coming through Garnet Fork every 2 weeks without fail, arranging my work around it the way you arrange work around a fixed point, all the other things orbiting this one. When I came, I found the laundry doing well and her brother Declan improving, his color good, his eyes clear, the freighting scheme coming together. I found Nora with her sleeves rolled and her hair up, always working, always with something on her hands, soap or ink or flour from the bread she sometimes made in the back. She would look up when I came in and say my name, and that was the finest sound I knew of. Just my name, said plainly by someone who meant it. I told Prine that fall that I was thinking of a change. That there was a woman in Garnet Fork, and I was considering whether there might be work in that territory, a more permanent base. He looked at me the way he'd looked at a lot of things over the years, with that particular stillness that meant he was running calculations you couldn't see. Then he said, "Is she a good woman?" I said she was the best I'd ever known. He set down his fork, he said, "About time," and went back to his breakfast. He did have work in that direction. A lease coming available on a small holding 5 miles north of Garnet Fork, not large, but real, with water and decent grass, and cattle work that would keep me close. The kind of arrangement that didn't happen unless a man had proven himself over years. He offered it, and I took it. I told Nora on a Thursday in October. We were on the bench outside her building after closing time, and the evenings were cold now, the kind of cold that smells like winter coming, and she had a wool shawl around her shoulders. She listened to everything I said. When I was finished, she said, "How much land?" I told her. "How many heads?" I told her. She said, "You'd need someone to keep the books." I said I was hoping she might know someone who could do that. She looked at me sideways. "I might," she said, something working in her face that was not quite a smile and more than one. I had the ring in my vest pocket. I'd bought it in the next town over from a jeweler who had one small case and 4 rings, and I had stood in front of that case for an embarrassingly long time trying to judge what Nora Callum would think was right. Finally, I chose the plainest one, a thin band of silver with nothing on it, no stone, no engraving, nothing decorative. Because plain was true and she was true, and I thought she would understand why I'd chosen it that way. I thought she would recognize it as a choice, not a lack of imagination. I gave it to her. She held it in her palm and looked at it in the October lamplight coming from the building behind us. Her face was, I don't have a word for what her face was, not the face of a young woman being given something surprising. More the face of a person who has waited out a long winter and is finally feeling the first real warmth of spring and is not performing the feeling, just having it. Something settling in her, the way I'd felt something settle in me that day in the laundry. She said, "You didn't dress it up." I said, "No." She said, "Good." She held it a moment longer. Then she held it out to me. I looked at her. She said, "Put it on properly." So I took it and I put it on her finger, and she held her hand up and looked at it there, and then she looked up at me, her dark eyes steady, and she put her hand flat against my chest. She could feel my heart through my shirt. She said, "Harlan Cross, I have known you 7 months. I said almost 8. And I have watched you do everything you said you would do, not more, not with any flourish, exactly what you said." Her hand pressed flat. "That is not a small thing, you know what I have watched men promise." I said I knew. She said, "I am choosing you because you are the most honest man I have ever stood next to. Because when 30 people stood in that street and watched, you walked across it. Not for glory, not looking for anything." Her thumb moved once against my shirt. "And everything since has been that same man." I put my arm around her. She let me. She turned into my side and put her head against my shoulder. And I held her there on that bench in the October cold, with the first star out above the ridge and the smell of wood smoke coming from the buildings up the street. After a long while she said quietly, 5 miles north." I said, 5 miles. She said, "I can manage a laundry from 5 miles. I said, "I expect you can manage most things from most distances." She laughed at that, a short, low sound against my shoulder. "You're learning." I held her there in the cold, that plain, capable, stubborn woman who had come west in a stagecoach with everything she owned in a canvas bag, and had refused to cry in the street, and had looked at me across a campfire, and named a thing I'd never found the words for myself. Who had built something from almost nothing in a town that hadn't known her. Who had looked at a tired, used-up foreman on a crooked porch in a mining camp and decided he was worth knowing, decided it clearly and without any pretending, and then done something about it the way she did everything, directly, without drama, with complete conviction. The star above the ridge was bright now. Cutter, at the hitching post on the street's edge, shifted his weight and blew once in the cold. The town around us made its small sounds, a door somewhere, voices down the block, the last of the day's traffic on the main street going quiet. I thought about the rope, the one I'd seen on the saddle horn when I rode in all those months ago, hanging slack, the sign of something done ugly and not cleaned up after. And I thought about how a man can ride into a strange town with nothing on his mind but the practical next thing and come out of it with everything changed. Not because he went looking for anything. Not because he had any plan beyond the next job, the next season, the next 50 miles. Just because he walked across the street. That was the whole of it. She straightened up beside me then. I could feel her decision in the movement, a woman ready for the next thing always. And she took hold of my hand, and I could feel the ring there, that small plain circle of silver between us. And we stood in the October dark together with the mountains behind the ridge as shadows against the sky. And every single thing in my life was, at that exact moment, exactly where it was supposed to be.